In music, consonance and dissonance form a structural dichotomy in which the terms define each other by mutual exclusion. A consonance is what is not dissonant, and reciprocally. However, a finer consideration shows that the distinction forms a gradation, for the most consonant to the most dissonant. Consonance and dissonance define a level of sweetness, harshness, pleasantness, unpleasantness, acceptability, unacceptability, of the sounds or intervals under consideration. As Hindemith stressed, the two concepts have never been completely explained, and for 1,000 years the definitions have varied. The opposition can be made in different contexts. In acoustics or psychophysiology, the distinction may be objective. In modern times, it usually is based on the perception of harmonic partials of the sounds considered, to such an extent that the distinction really holds only in the case of harmonic sounds. In music, even if the opposition often is founded on the preceding objective distinction, it more often is subjective, conventional, cultural, and style-dependent. Dissonance can then be defined as a combination of sounds that does not belong to the style under consideration. In recent music, what is considered stylistically dissonant may even correspond to what is said to be consonant in the context of acoustics. In both cases, the distinction mainly concerns simultaneous sounds. If successive sounds are considered, their consonance or dissonance depends on the memorial retention of the first sound while the second is heard. For this reason, consonance and dissonance have been considered, particularly in the case of polyphonic Occidental music, and the present article is concerned mainly with this case. Most historical definitions of consonance and dissonance since about the 16th century have stressed the pleasant, unpleasant, or agreeable, disagreeable character. This may be justifiable in a psychophysiological context, but much less in a musical context. Properly speaking, dissonances often play a decisive role in making music pleasant, even in a generally consonant context, which is one of the reasons why the musical definition of consonance-dissonance cannot match the psychophysiologic definition. In addition, the oppositions pleasant, unpleasant, or agreeable, disagreeable evidence a confusion between the concepts of dissonance and of noise. While consonance and dissonance exist only between sounds and therefore necessarily describe intervals, Occidental music theory often considers that, in a dissonant chord, one of the tones alone is in itself the dissonance. It is this tone in particular that needs resolution through a specific voice-leading consonance. The definition of consonance has been variously based on experience, frequency, and both physical and psychological considerations. These include perception blend, fusion, perception of unity, a tonal fusion between two notes, frequency ratios, with ratios of lower simple numbers being more consonant than those that are higher. Many of these definitions do not require exact integer tunings, only approximation. Coincidence of partials, with consonance being a greater coincidence of partials. By this definition, consonance is dependent not only on the width of the interval between two notes, but also on the combined spectral distribution and thus sound quality of the notes. Thus, a note and the note one octave higher are highly consonant because the partials of the higher note are also partials of the lower note. Although Helmholtz's work focused almost exclusively on harmonic timbres and also the tunings, subsequent work has generalized his findings to embrace non-harmonic tunings and timbres. Fusion or pattern matching. Fundamentals may be perceived through pattern matching of the separately analyzed partials to a best fit exact harmonic template or the best fit subharmonic Harmonics may be perceptually fused into one entity, consonances being those that include perfect consonances, unisons and octaves, perfect fourths and perfect fifths, imperfect consonances, major thirds and minor sixths, minor thirds and major sixths. Both continuity consonances are continuous and dissonances are intermittent in sensation, determined by coincidence of partials. These may be generalized as simplicity. A stable tone combination is a consonance. Consonances are points of arrival, rest, and resolution. Dissonance. An unstable tone combination is a dissonance. Its tension demands an onward motion to a stable chord. Thus, dissonant chords are active. Traditionally, they have been considered harsh and have expressed pain, grief, and conflict. In Western music, dissonance is the quality of sounds that seems unstable and has an oral need to resolve to a stable consonance. Both consonance and dissonance are words applied to harmony, chords, and intervals, and, by extension, to melody, tonality, and even rhythm and meter. Although there are physical and neurological facts important to understanding the idea of dissonance, the precise definition of dissonance is culturally conditioned. Definitions of and conventions of usage related to dissonance vary greatly among different musical styles, traditions, and cultures. Nevertheless, the basic ideas of dissonance, consonance, and resolution exist in some form in all musical traditions that have a concept of melody, harmony, or tonality. Dissonance being the complement of consonance, it may be defined, as above, as non-coincidence of partials, lack of fusion or pattern matching, or as complexity. Additional confusion about the idea of dissonance is created by the fact that musicians and writers sometimes use the word dissonance and related terms in a precise and carefully defined way, more often in an informal way and very often in a metaphorical sense. For many musicians and composers, the essential ideas of dissonance and resolution are vitally important ones that deeply inform the musical thinking on a number of levels. Despite the fact that words like unpleasant and grating are often used to explain the sound of dissonance, or music with a harmonic tonal basis, even music perceived as generally harmonious, incorporates some degree of dissonance. The build-up and release of tension, which can occur on every level from the subtle to the crass, is partially responsible for what listeners perceive as beauty, emotion, and expressiveness in music. Dissonance and musical style. The concept of dissonance does not belong to the domain of harmony as it is presented as by nature, but is derived from voice leading, which is an essential constituent of art. Understanding a particular musical style's treatment of dissonance, what is considered dissonant and what rules or procedures govern how dissonant intervals, chords, or notes are treated, is key in understanding that particular style. For instance, harmony is generally governed by chords, which are collections of notes defined as tolerably consonant by the style. Any note that does not fall within the prevailing harmony is considered dissonant. A given style typically pays attention to how its musical structure approaches dissonance, and even more to how they resolve, to how they fit within the meter and rhythm, and to how they lie within the phrase. Dissonance in traditional music. Sharp dissonant intervals and chords play a prominent role in many traditional musical cultures. Vocal polyphonic traditions from Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Albania, Latvia, Georgia, Nuristan. Some Vietnamese and Chinese minority singing traditions, Lithuanian Sutartines. Some polyphonic traditions from Flores and Melanesia are predominantly based on the use of sharp dissonant intervals and chords. The most prominent dissonance in most of these cultures is the interval of the neutral second. This interval is known to create the maximum sharpness and is known in German ethnomusicology under the term Schwebungsdialog. diphony. Consonance and dissonance in history of Western music. Dissonance has been understood and heard differently in different musical traditions, cultures, styles, and time periods. Relaxation and tension have been used as analogy since the time of Aristotle till the present. Antiquity and Middle Ages. In ancient Greece, harmonia denoted the production of a unified complex, particularly one expressible in numerical ratios. Applied to music, the concept concerned how sounds in a scale or a melody fit together. The term symphonos was used by Aristophanes and others to describe the intervals of the fourth, the fifth, the octave, and the doublings. Other intervals were said diaphonos. This terminology probably referred to the Pythagorean tuning, where fourths, fifths, and octaves were directly tunable, while the other degrees could only be tuned by combinations of the preceding. Until the advent of polyphony and even later, this remained the basis of the concept of consonance, dissonance in Occidental theory. In the early Middle Ages, the Latin term consonantia translated either harmonia or symphonia. Boethius characterizes consonance by its sweetness, dissonance by its harshness. Consonance is the blending of a high sound with a low one, sweetly and uniformly arriving to the ears. Dissonance is the harsh and unhappy percussion of two sounds mixed together. It remains unclear, however, whether this could refer to simultaneous sounds. The case becomes clear, however, with Hucbald of St. Amand, who writes, "Consonance is the measured and concordant blending of two sounds, which will come about only when two simultaneous sounds from different sources combine into a single musical whole. There are 6 of these consonances, 3 simple and 3 composite: octave, fifth, fourth, and octave plus fifth, octave plus fourth, and double octave." According to Johannes de Garlandia, perfect consonants, unisons and octaves; median consonants, fourths and fifths; imperfect consonants, minor and major thirds; imperfect dissonance, major sixth and minor seventh; median dissonance, tone and minor sixth; perfect dissonance, semitone, tritone, major seventh. One example of imperfect consonance is previously considered dissonances in Guillaume de Machaut's Je ne cure pas quonques. According to Margot Schulte, stable, purely blending, unisons and octaves; optimally blending, fourths and fifths; unstable, relatively blending, minor and major thirds; relatively tense, major seconds, minor sevenths, and major sixths; strongly discordant, minor seconds, tritonus, and major sevenths, and often minor sixths. It is worth noting that perfect and imperfect and the notion of being must be taken in their contemporaneous Latin meanings to understand these terms, such that imperfect is unfinished or incomplete, and thus an imperfect dissonance is not quite manifestly dissonant, and perfect consonance is done almost to the point of excess. Also, inversion of intervals and octave reduction were yet unknown during the Middle Ages. Due to the different tuning systems compared to modern times, the minor seventh and major ninth were harmonic consonances, meaning that they correctly reproduced the interval ratios of the harmonic series, which softened a bad effect. They were also often filled in by pairs of perfect fourths and perfect fifths respectively, forming resonant units characteristic of the musics of the time, where resonance forms a complementary trine with the categories of consonance and dissonance. Conversely, the thirds and sixths were tempered severely from pure ratios, and in practice usually treated as dissonances in the sense that they had to resolve to form complete perfect cadences and stable sonorities. The salient differences from modern conception: parallel fourths and fifths were acceptable and necessary. Open fourths and fifths inside octaves were the characteristic stable sonority in 3 or more voices. Minor sevenths and major ninths were fully structural. Tritones, as a deponent sort of fourth or fifth, were sometimes stacked with perfect fourths and fifths. Thirds and sixths were not the sort of intervals upon which stable harmonies were based. Final cadential consonances of fourths, fifths, and octaves need not be the target of resolution on a beat-to-beat time basis. Minor sevenths and major ninths may move to octaves forthwith, or sixths to fifths, but the fourths and fifths within may become dissonant 5/3, 6/3, or 6/4 chordioids, continuing the succession of non-consonant sonorities for time spans limited only by the next cadence. Renaissance. In early Renaissance music, intervals such as the perfect fourth were considered dissonances that must be immediately resolved. The regular deltas es required that imperfect consonances should resolve to a perfect one by half-step progression in one voice and a whole-step progression in another. Anonymous 13 allowed 2 or 3, the Optima Introductio 3 or 4, and Anonymous 11 4 or 5 successive imperfect consonances. By the end of the 15th century, imperfect consonances were no longer tension sonorities but, as evidenced by the allowance of the successions argued for by Adam von Fulda, independent sonorities, according to Fulda. Although older scholars once would forbid all sequences of more than 3 or 4 imperfect consonances, we who are more modern allow them. Quote, Common practice period. In the common practice period, musical style required preparation for all dissonances, followed by and then resolution to a consonance. There was also a distinction between melodic and harmonic dissonance. Dissonant melodic intervals included the tritone and all augmented and diminished intervals. Dissonant harmonic intervals included minor second and major seventh, augmented fourth and diminished fifth. Thus, Western musical history can be seen as progressing from a limited definition of consonants to an ever wider definition of consonants. Early in history, only intervals low in the overtone series were considered consonant. As time progressed, intervals ever higher on the overtone series were considered as such. The final result of this was the so-called emancipation of the dissonance by some 20th-century composers. Early 20th-century American composer Henry Cowell viewed tone clusters as the use of higher and higher overtones. Despite the fact that this idea of the historical progression towards the acceptance of ever greater levels of dissonance is somewhat oversimplified, and glosses over important developments in the history of Western music, the general idea was attractive to many 20th-century modernist composers and is considered a formative meta-narrative of musical modernism. Composers in the Baroque era were well aware of the expressive potential of dissonance. Some commentators see Bach's use of dissonance in his sacred cantatas as having religious symbolic significance. In the opening aria of Cantata BWV 54, Wie der Stefan durch der Sund, nearly every strong beat carries a dissonance. Albert Schweitzer says that this aria begins with an alarming chord of the seventh. It is meant to depict the horror of the curse upon sin that is threatened in the text. Gilles Whittaker points out that the 32 continuo quavers of the initial 4 bars support 4 consonances only. All the rest are dissonances, 12 of them being chords containing 5 different notes. It is a remarkable picture of desperate and unflinching resistance to the Christian to the felt powers of evil. Mozart's music contains a number of quite radical experiments in dissonance. The following comes from his Adagio and Fugue in C minor, K. 546, Mozart's Quartet in C major, K. 465, opens with an Adagio introduction that gave the work its nickname, the Dissonance Quartet. There are several passing dissonances in this Adagio passage, for example on the first beat of bar 3. However, the most striking effect here is implied, rather than sounded explicitly. The A-flat in the first bar is contradicted by the high A natural in the second bar, but these notes do not sound together as a discord. An even more famous example from Mozart comes in a magical passage from the slow movement of his popular Elvira Madigan Piano Concerto 21, K. 467, where the subtle but quite explicit dissonances on the first beats of each bar are enhanced by exquisite orchestration. Philip Radcliffe speaks of this as a remarkably poignant passage with surprisingly sharp dissonances. Radcliffe says that the dissonances here have a vivid foretaste of Schumann, and the way they gently melt into the major key is equally prophetic. If Schubert, quote, "The finale of Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 opens with a startling discord, consisting of a B-flat inserted into a D minor chord. Roger Scruton alludes to Wagner's description of this chord as introducing a Heuschrecken's fanfare, horror fanfare. Quote, "When this passage returns later in the same movement, the sound is further complicated with the addition of a diminished seventh chord, creating, in Scruton's words, the most atrocious dissonance that Beethoven ever wrote. A first inversion D minor triad containing all the notes of the D minor harmonic scale." Robert Schumann's song Auf einer Burg from his cycle Lieder Kreis op. 39 climaxes on a striking dissonance in the 14th bar. As Nicholas Cook points out, this is the only chord in the whole song that Schumann marks with an accent. Quote, Cook goes on to stress that what makes this chord so effective is Schumann's placing of it in its musical context, in what leads up to it and what comes of it. Quote, Cook explains further how the interweaving of lines in both piano and voice parts in the bars leading up to this chord have set on a kind of collision course, hence the feeling of tension rising steadily to a breaking point. Quote, "Another example of a cumulative build-up of dissonance from the early 20th century can be found in the Adagio that opens Mahler's unfinished 10th Symphony. Taruscan pauses this chord as a diminished 19th, a searingly dissonant dominant harmony containing 9 different pitches. Who knows what Guido Adler, for whom the second and third symphonies already contained unprecedented cacophonies, might have called it. One example of modernist dissonance comes from a work that received its first performance in 1913, 3 years after the Mahler. The West's progressive embrace of increasingly dissonant intervals occurred almost entirely within the context of harmonic timbres, as produced by vibrating strings and columns of air, on which the West's dominant musical instruments are based. By generalizing Helmholtz's notion of consonance to embrace non-harmonic timbres and the related tunings, consonance has recently been emancipated from harmonic timbres and the related tunings, using electronically controlled pseudo-harmonic timbres, rather than strictly harmonic acoustic timbres, provides tonality with new structural resources such as dynamic tonality. These new resources provide musicians with an alternative to pursuing the musical uses of ever higher partials of harmonic timbres and, in some people's minds, may resolve what Arnold Schoenberg described as the crisis of tonality. Neoclassic harmonic consonance theory. George Russell, in his 1953 Lydian chromatic concept of tonal organization, presents a slightly different view from classical practice, one widely taken up in jazz. He regards the tritone over the tonic as a rather consonant interval due to its derivation from the Lydian dominant 13th chord. In effect, he returns to a medieval consideration of harmonic consonants, that intervals when not subject to octave equivalence and correctly reproducing the mathematical ratios of the harmonic series are truly non-dissonant. Thus the harmonic minor 7th natural major 9th half-sharp 11th note, half-flat 13th note, and half-flat 15th note must necessarily be consonant. Octave equivalence is no longer unquestioned. Note that most of these pitches exist only in a universe of microtones smaller than a half-step. Notice also that we already freely take the flat 7th note for the just 7th of the harmonic series in chords. Russell extends by approximation the virtual merits of harmonic consonants to the 1-2-T-E-T tuning system of jazz and the 12-note octave of the piano, granting consonance to the sharp 11th note, that accidental being the sole pitch difference between the major scale and the Lydian mode, replaces or supplements the Mixolydian scale of the dominant chord as the source from which to derive extended tertian harmony. Dan Hale, in his 1980 The Jazz Language, extends the same idea of harmonic consonance and intact octave displacement to alter Paul Hindemith's Series 2 gradation table from the craft of musical composition, in contradistinction to Hindemith, whose scale of consonance and dissonance is currently the de facto standard. Hale places the minor 9th as the most dissonant interval of all, more dissonant than the minor 2nd, to which it was once considered by all as octave equivalent. He also promotes the tritone from most dissonant position to one just a little less consonant than the perfect 4th and perfect 5th. For context, unstated in these theories is that musicians of the Romantic era had effectively promoted the major 9th and minor 7th to a legitimacy of harmonic consonance as well, in the fabrics of 4-note chords. Instruments producing non-harmonic overtone series. Musical instruments like bells and xylophones, called idiophones, are played such that the relatively stiff, non-trivial mass is excited to vibration by means of a blow. This contrasts with violins, flutes, or drums, where the vibrating medium is a light, supple string, column of air, or membrane. The overtones of the inharmonic series produced by such instruments may differ greatly from that of the rest of the orchestra, and the consonance or dissonance of the harmonic intervals as well. According to John Gowans, the Carolines' harmony profile is summarized: consonant, major 3rd, tritone, minor 6th, perfect 4th, perfect 5th, and possibly minor 7th or even major 2nd. Dissonant, major 3rd, major 6th. Variable upon individual instrument, major 7th. Interval inversion does not apply.